My primary role is more climate financing at the moment, but I've spent the last 20 plus years doing energy around the whole Pacific. So this is sharing some of the knowledge, some of the projects that I have been involved. Before we go into renewable energy and tourism, yeah, next one, please, Ivan. Before we go to the renewable energy and tourism, perhaps it's good to set the scene and try and see where is energy used in tourism, and then you try to talk about, you try and line up what renewable energy that's applicable. So the presentation outline is very broad. It's not that long, but we'll go through the process, and then at the end we'll come back to your discussions that you've been having over yesterday and this morning. So, yeah, next one, please. So, into context, the Samoa Energy Review, this was, I think, something done just a few years ago. So, if you look at the whole energy consumption, in this case, it's electricity. If you look at the whole energy consumption, you can see where the tourism comes in, and that has been circled, just highlighting the consumption at the hotel level. So the total consumption in Samoa, the tourism sector for this matter, for this case, only uses 2%. Yeah, so just to put a number that forms a baseline. So if you look at tourism, where is energy used in the tourism? So I'll draw your attention on the left, areas of energy used in tourism. So you can see that's one on travel. So it can be international, it can be local, and then by road, by sea, by air. Yeah, and then when you come to the middle portion, where you have accommodation, that's where the premises is. So that's where bulk of that 2% is consumed over there. So if you look at, if you take a hotel, for example, so you have air conditioning, you have hot water, you have all the energy used in the kitchen and so forth. And then you have another one where it's activities. So, you know, you have motorized activities and entertainment. These are all energy consuming areas. So I would like to draw your attention to the middle one where the blue arrow points. If you look at that, that's where all the energy sources comes from. You have diesel, you have unleaded, you have electricity from the grid. In this case, that's EPC. Some hotels have their own generators, yeah, so they generate their own electricity and so forth. The case study on the right in that pie chart demonstrates how the energy is split across, for example, the tourism sector. Yeah, so that's simply a demonstration that was done, a survey done in Fiji, but the percentage splits, I'd say it's applicable more or less across the tourism sector in the Pacific. So this sets the scene. If you look at accommodation in the middle on your left, that's the 2%, yeah, that we saw in the previous pie chart. Yeah, your next one, please. So what does the tourism energy bill look like? So when a hotel gets its bill from EPC, for instance, that 2%, that's the composition of that whole 2%. If you look at the pie chart, most of it is on air conditioning. Yeah, that's where most of the electricity is consumed and so forth. The highlighted areas, those three, those are the high energy consuming areas. So in the tourism sector, if you look at, for example, a premises or a hotel, in this case, you know, just like Tomosina, Lava, you'll have the electricity bill more or less divided in this manner. At the same time, right at the top, the energy sources, if you look at it, you have, you know, the fossil fuels, you have electricity, and you have LPG, just where the energy sources are coming from for a hotel as an example. So the whole message here is if you're trying to conserve something, conserve energy, you target those circled ones. Yeah, that's where the high consumption area is. So the next slide will, that's simply alluding to energy efficiency. Remember, we haven't reached renewable energy yet. What we have is we have set the baseline where energy is consumed, and then we're looking at efficiency at the moment. So an analogy against this is like a water tank. If you have a leaking water tank, you don't keep on filling it. Yeah, you fix that leak first. So if you have a high consumed or a high electricity bill, you don't simply just put in renewable energy. You try and look at where can you be more efficient, save some energy first, then you talk about renewables. So we'll go on to renewables. So what are the examples of renewable energy that tourism sector can use? I think you're familiar now with solar hot water systems. Yeah, you're familiar with solar air conditioning. I think it's a very, you more or less hear that on advertisements on the radio almost every 20 to 30 minutes. They're promoting solar air conditioning. You have those electric run transportations. So if you have a big compound like the Thomasina as an example, you'd rather use a golf cart to move from one end to the other end rather than jumping onto a four-wheel drive or the rest. And of course, there are certain areas where you can combine solar and wind. Yeah, so when I say solar, I think you're quite familiar. If I say wind, that refers to a sort of a wind turbine. Some people refer to as a windmill. Yeah, so that are the areas that you can, the tourism sector can tap into. Remember, this is based on what are the energy use areas that we have seen in the initial slides. So next one, please. So how do we align that to the tourism sector? We go back to the initial slide. We had transportation, we had accommodation, and we had entertainment and so forth activities at the bottom. So if you look at the sources of energy in the middle, if you look at accommodation on your left, there's hot water there. So instead of using gas or electric hot water systems, you can go straight to solar hot water systems. Yeah, a system like that, I think, costs around $4,000 to $5,000, maybe more, but then it pays back quite easily. The other areas are, as I mentioned, solar air conditioning systems and so forth. So that's where the tourism can come, renewable energy can come in to substitute some of the energy sources that you already have in the sector. Yes, next one. So when we come down to, as we narrow it down, what's required? What's required for renewable energy to promptly feature in tourism? There's a lot of things that can be done at a policy level. Yeah, and those are just some elements that you allude to. For example, you can waive all the taxes on renewable energy equipment. So if you import solar panel, it should be tax-free. Yeah, that's if the government waives it. If the government doesn't waive that, then you still have to pay the tax. But that's some of the incentives available. Aside from that, you need to have some financing mechanisms in place. Yeah, no one will fork out a couple of $100,000 to put a solar system just out of the blue from if you have a financing mechanism that you can tap in, then that's great. I'll come to some examples. The tax-free area, there are certain governments around the Pacific, for example, Kiribati, Fiji. I think most governments in the islands, they say, if you bring in renewable energy technology, you just pay the cost. You don't pay any taxes associated with it. When you come to financial mechanisms, the banks, commercial banks like ANZ and BSP, they can have certain, I'd say certain loan-oriented packages that is targeted to renewable energy. Yeah, so, or even the Samoa Development Bank, for instance. I'll come to an example later on in the case studies, but these are some of the areas that can entice the tourism sector to move towards renewable energy. And I think the topic that the SPTO was going to touch on is the ecotourism. Yeah, so a lot of countries have gone down that path, incorporating renewable energy to it. So you are off-grid, meaning you're not connected to the, in this case, you're not connected to the EPC grid. Next one, please. Okay, so case studies, just to demonstrate some of the things that happen or is happening in the Pacific in terms of tourism and renewable energy. So I'll take us to Palau first. In the next one, please. So this case study, that's a B&B facility in Palau. You can see solar panels on the rooftop, very basic accommodation type, tucked away in, I say, amongst the mangroves. Okay, so how this was possible? How this was possible? If you look at the whole bullet points on that slide, it says it's a Palau Development Bank initiative. So the Palau Development Bank provides a loan to tourism, like for example, a B&B accommodation, or you have a beach valley. They can provide small loans, right from, I think, about $2,000 or even less, $1,000 all the way to $10,000. And those kind of loans are, they're interest free. So the government subsidizes them. Yeah, so you don't pay an interest. So it entices the particular, I'd say the entity or the B&B owners in this case to invest on that particular element. There's also policy requirements, as I mentioned. Put it into the Samoa context, EPC may have an act, maybe called the EPC Act, that does not allow anybody else to generate electricity. So that means everyone has to buy from the grid. So you cannot proceed to such projects when that act is not amended. Yeah, so you have to open it up, for instance. You can open it up with limitations, meaning, I think there's somewhere I mentioned over there is, if you open it up, you can limit the number of new installations, renewable energy, so it does not destabilize the EPC grid. So destabilizing meaning, for example, if you have a solar system like the ones at the airport, a big one, if that is very large, bigger than that, maybe 2 or 3 times that, once you have a cloud over the solar panels, the EPC grid can simply stall, meaning it'll go into blackout mode. Yeah, it's because of the fluctuations that brings into the whole system. So it's an engineering, more or less an engineering issue. So the message here, yes, tourism can get involved with renewable energy, but you need some supporting elements like policy, financing mechanisms, and so forth. There's a lot of players involved. It's not only tourism and the guys who generate electricity. So we'll go to our next one, Ivan. Yes, this is in Fiji. it's called Turtle Island, the Turtle Island Resort. That's the installation on the top left. That installation costs about just over $1 million US. That was installed in, I think, 2013. So if you look at the amount of savings, it's quite substantial. Why it's substantial? It's only based on the cost of diesel. Yeah. So before that solar system, Turtle Island's electricity was supplied from a generator. 24 hours, 7 days a week. You have to fill the generators with diesel all the time. Now with that installation, which supplies about 56% of the electricity demand, you result with about $100,000 US savings every year. So if you consider the cost and consider the savings since 2013, so it's more or less almost paid off, or it's paid off. Yeah, but noting with other elements that are not, for example, you don't have to maintain your diesel generators that many times. Reduce your costs in terms of maintenance and other, I'd say, ripple benefits that comes in. So the whole message here is there's benefits not only in terms of dollars, but there's benefits as well in terms of you look at CO2 emissions. It saves about 200 tons every year. It's small, but then that particular resort has vision towards the NDCs, for, in this case. So this is another demonstration of use of renewables in the tourism sector. So our next slide brings us back here to Samoa. I understand everyone sees that's a set of solar panels near the airport, based at biomass plant around the airport area as well. And of course, this building on the roof, we currently have about 100 kilowatts of solar. Yeah, so how does all these things happen? So if you own a hotel, for example, in this case, to make it more applicable, you want to put solar panels on your roof. How will you make that happen? Yeah, you got your money, you got an engineer to do it, but then what else do you need? Yeah, and there is what is called an independent power producer, an IPP. If you look at the installation at the airport, that is an IPP arrangement that is privately owned. When they generate electricity, they sell it to EPC. Yeah, so EPC will buy it at, for example, 40 cents per unit, and EPC sells to everybody in the residential sector. Now I think it's about 60 something, yeah, or 70 cents. So the IPP will recover its investment. If that IPP at the airport spends about $10 million, what they need with EPC is what we call a power purchase agreement that will lay down the rules. So for $10 million investment, selling at 40 cents per unit, and if you're generating so many 100 units or thousands of units, you can imagine how long you have to stay in operation to recover your 10 million investment. You can bring it to a very small scale like the one over here in this climate change center. You can bring it to that. Again, you have the same type of arrangement, but it's at a smaller scale. Yeah. So what happens in, for example, in the center here, that 100 kilowatts generates a certain element of electricity, goes into the EPC grid. There's no exchange of dollars. Yeah, it goes into the EPC grid. At the end of the month, SPREP receives the electricity bill. Yeah, so if scrap needs to pay $5,000 for that month, it takes off how much electricity that you have generated up from here. So it offsets in that way. Yeah, so there's no exchange of dollars on the counter. It's simply just offsetting. So that sort of arrangement can happen to any big tourism setup. There are small scale ones. If you want to know small scale ones, then small scale ones like beach volleys. You can see a lot of beach volleys now are using a small solar panel with a light sufficient to provide light in the night and so forth. So this simply demonstrates some of the case studies of what can happen in the tourism sector. Okay, now we come back to what everyone has been talking about yesterday and today. We talked about EIAs. We talked about some of the construction permits that's required and so forth. For energy, even if you're building for example, the airport and the biomass plant, you still need a development permit from, I think, Puma is in this case. You still need to do an EIA. Yeah, you're going to dig the ground, you still need to do an EIA. With solar, it's straightforward because it's just a panel. You put it as long as the sun shines, that's great. If you're putting a wind turbine, that's even more challenging. Your EIA, again, you're digging the ground. You have to also look at what entities like SPREP, World Bank, ADB call the environment social safeguards. Yeah, that's another assessment that you need to show. So if you're putting a wind turbine, you have to ensure that that wind farm it's not too noisy to the neighborhood. So you can't just go and construct a wind farm in the middle of the village. Yeah, you won't pass the social side of things. Also, the nature in terms of birds. Yeah, if it's a path for birds who are migrating or moving from a certain habitat to another, the turbines will kill them. So that's another area. So there's a lot of things tied to it, much more than simply an EIA and doing a social safeguards in this case. So at the end of the day, when you talk about energy infrastructure, you can imagine when I remember when the hydro at Afulilo was constructed, and then they were trying to do another hydro Sili. Is it the Sili River? Is it in Upol? Savai. And I remember that one, everything was in place, but then you had issues around the land and other resources. Yeah. So it again comes back to this kind of infrastructure. So any energy infrastructure is very, I'd say it's very crucial. So renewable energy, yes, everyone jumps into it because you can save money, but then you have to be inclusive and holistic in the sense when you measure the benefit of that dollars against the benefit of the environment, the social aspects and so forth. So these are very crucial areas, and I think it lines up to some of the discussions that you have had yesterday and this morning. So with that, I know we'll have some discussions after this, but I just wanted to pose certain areas that we can easily talk about. For example, if you look at, is there a role for renewable energy? Yes, there is. Yeah, but then there's so many factors to it. It's not as simple as it seems, or it's not as simple as I have the money, I can simply go and do it. Yeah, there's a lot of things that's tied into it, and a lot of I think the discussions from yesterday and today, noting the legislative that legislation that you need to adhere to, the standards, the assessments you have to do. I think this morning we talked about waste. Yeah, any construction to this matter generates waste. So all those things have to come in as a complete package if you want to invest in renewable energy. So colleagues, I'll stop here. And if there's any areas for discussion, we can always go towards that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupeni. That was really good. And I'm sure it's started a few cogs turning in people's heads to ask questions. I can't see the floor very clearly because of my monitor. So I'll before we go to the room, just a couple of things I wanted to add into that from an EIA perspective. Yes, renewables can be a great thing. And a lot of countries are looking at it and trying to use it to reduce their carbon emissions as well as make themselves more energy efficient. But very key points that Rupeni brought up at the beginning. You don't keep pouring water into a bucket if there's a hole in the bottom. So when you're looking at your developments, first thing you do when you look at your energy costs and see that they're very high is you start looking at, as you pointed out, what are your key drains? What's using the majority of your power? And in tourism, in the accommodation, it's the air conditioning. And I've picked this up from when I've traveled around the Pacific and I've worked in the different countries. I go and stay at the hotels, even the small family-run ones, and I'll go in, check into my room, and I walk in, it's like a refrigerator. They've turned the air conditioner down to 16 degrees. And it's like, I don't need it that cold. So I'll turn it back up. And then when I leave the room, I'll turn it off. And then I come back in and the cleaners have been in there and it's been running and it's at 16 degrees. So simple policies within the actual resort itself, where they ask guests to keep their air conditioning, or they have a set controller and they set it at 22 or 23 at particular times, and they have proper doors that close and windows that keep the air conditioning actually in. This can save them a lot of money in the long run, so that they can start really reducing their energy bill. The other points that he talked about is the waste that's associated with this and the EIA approvals process. I reviewed a number of these in the Federated States of Micronesia for the Asia Development Bank. I've worked on wind farms and solar plant proposals here in Australia before. It is, as he said, it's not necessarily straightforward. When you're doing with ADB, we actually started looking at it and said, well, if we're going to put solar panels in, rather than clearing land, because often that's the first thing people do is, okay, let's look for some land. You can actually look at buildings. If you've got government buildings or if you've got pre-existing structures, mount them on the roofs. They work fantastically up there and they don't get shaded as often by trees. You can also float them on water. Solar panels work really well on water. They actually work better if they're floating on fresh water, because they benefit you if you're putting them on reservoirs, if they were planning to do in Yap, because it stops evaporation and it also keeps the thermal buffer in a much more consistent temperature range. So panels like to work when they're not being extremely hot or extremely cold. So water's a really good temperature thermal regulator. And then there's the waste. The legacy waste. What do you do once your system is no longer viable? What do you do with your batteries? What do you do with your panels? So things to think about. And have we got any questions coming in on the chat? Nope. So I'll open it to the floor. And once again, thank you, Rupeni. That was really well-rounded. I like the examples you presented in regards to the savings on diesel costs. And if you did the calculations, when you saw that they outlaid just over $1 million to put them in, and they were saving about $124,000 a year on diesel when they put it in 2013, they were on track to basically zero out their setup costs for that before the pandemic hit. So depending on whether or not they're still using the system, they're probably not, they've recouped their money on the savings on diesel outlay. They're just some other thoughts there. And has anyone raised their hand? No? Okay. Ivan, if you could identify anyone who's wanting to ask a question or make a statement in the room.
Yes. Thank you, Benny. So do we have any questions in the room? Okay, we have one question for Vera.
Okay.
Thanks, Opeti. It's not a question. It's a statement from the Samoa Tourism Authority. They are launching their tourism climate change strategy this year. And one of the objectives is renewable energy, promoting renewable energy for the tourist operators. And one of the big needs for this strategy is funding. And if there is any available funding for STA to tap into renewable energy, it would be very much appreciated on behalf of our STA team.
Is that a question for Vicky or just a question? Okay. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Craig and Alan. May I ask, Mr. Rupeli said he shared a word with us, environmental social safeguards. You all understand what that means? Raise up your hand if you understand it. If you understand it, please raise up.
I heard about it.
You heard about it. That's good. Always a headache. Yes, you heard about it. That's good. That's a good step. Environmental social safety. Mr. Rupeli, please. Can you talk more about what does that mean? Environmental social safety. We can check
Sure.
just to
Sure.
because you use the term environmental safety.
Yeah. Thank you, Chope. Maybe before that, I'll sort of respond to your funding. Looking at funding in terms of renewable energy. At the moment, it's there's a lot of funds out there. The challenge in the Pacific is you don't meet the matrix, meaning you don't meet the criteria. The need is fine. The need is always there, but you don't meet the criteria. For example, if you invest $10 million, how much electricity can you generate? How much CO2 can you save? And if you equate it, the Pacific transaction cost comes to around 4,000 to 6,000 US dollars per ton. Yeah, so you need to invest, let's say $6,000 USD to 1 ton of CO2. The global average is only $300. So why such a difference? It's a transaction cost to build or to go towards such technology Pacific. That solar panel is manufactured in China, Europe, Germany. Yeah. By the time, if you buy a solar panel in let's say Germany, you're looking at more or less 20 or maybe 5 cents US a watt. That's the ratio. If you buy a solar panel here in the Pacific, it's about $1.50 per watt. Yeah? And that whole difference adds to transaction cost. So to come to your comment, yes, there's funding there, but the idea is when you look for funding, you use renewable energy with something else. For example, renewable energy and perhaps water pumping, renewable energy and agriculture. Yeah? So if you have a tourism setup close to a certain area, you can invest from that. Or there are other innovative ways of doing it. The whole message is if you put a funding proposal just to put a solar panel on the roof, it's very difficult to get. Very difficult to get. That's why financing mechanisms I mentioned earlier is very important. Unless there's funding that comes from, let's say, government, for example, and subsidizes the loan packages that's targeted such development, then you may find an area to get funding. So that just an example and just some of the things, but feel free to discuss this out of the session. Coming back to Chop's sort of area in terms of environment, social safeguards. You know, there are some terminologies that seems to sort of scare people off. You know, you have a terminology and then you scare them, but then when you try and read all the details, oh, I was doing this some years ago in a different context. Yeah. So social and environment safeguards. I'll give you an example of the SPREP in its accreditation to the Green Climate Fund has to have a social environment and social safeguards policy. And that policy outlines certain principles, I think about 6 principles and 10 safeguards. So whenever you have a development that comes up, you do a screening process to look at what your project will bring about. So you look at the environment aspects. The environment aspects has a lot of things involved, including waste. Yeah, waste is part of that. When you look at the social aspects, you look at the impact on community. You look at, you know, is there a risk for children? Is there a risk for vulnerable people? Is there a risk for indigenous people? And so forth. The list keeps on going. It's not to criticize your development and not to criticize your project. These things are set for you. So when you do your project proposal or when you implement your project, you have a plan on how to mitigate this. Yeah? So that's the whole message. This triggers certain areas to be watchful of. But the most important part is, how do you mitigate it? How do you mitigate them? You may not be able to get rid of it, but you can mitigate them while you are developing your project. Yeah, so that's a whole, I'd say, area in terms of environment and social safety. So whenever you have an energy project, for example, if you want to build a hydro here in Samoa, it's very, I'd say the criteria or the bar is very high in terms of environment and social safeguards. You'll be looking at elements like, if I build a dam here, does it affect the rest of the villages downstream? Yeah. If I divert the water just to get the dam and then brings it back on stream, will it affect the ecosystem where you're trying to put the dam in? You're silting, when silting occurs, how do you envisage to clear that up, and what will you do, yeah, with it? So it's a whole lot of I'd say elements involved, but the whole idea is, if you plan to mitigate them, that's conducive to the environment and the social elements, then it shows policies, or it shows the country that you're mindful of those and you're trying to minimize as much as you possible in terms of effects. So I hope this adds a bit, Choppy, and please contribute.
Yes, colleagues, to make it relevant to Mr. Bay. There was how many steps did Puma presented yesterday? What do you call them? BCA 4 steps. 5. So that is a good example of environmental social safeguard. A step to be followed to prevent impact on environment, people, and so on. So that is a safeguard. Thank you. Yes, that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I don't personally have a question at the moment, but there is a couple of questions that were sort of being written in the chat here from SBTO. Not specifically a question.
We have a question here on the floor.
There's a
We
question
just
here.
have the what? Okay.
Presentation. But I can say that I know that achieving renewable energy is expensive, but it has its own benefits. How reliable is renewable energy for improving tourism, especially during COVID, when the industry is facing?
Okay, when you talk about reliability, there's a lot of things that come to it. So you can design a system that can continue to provide you power for 5 days continuously, even if it's raining. Yeah, even if it's raining, you can design a system. So if you're looking at reliability, you can go without the sun for 5 days, even more. It's simply an engineering design that you have to do. Okay, but it will cost you something. Yeah? When you come back to the other reliability in terms of renewable energy, it is very difficult to, if you look at a lot of countries, they would like to target 100% renewable energy. It looks nice in your speech or in wherever you're delivering that, but the reality is very difficult. Yeah, those if you're talking about electricity, those generators will be always there, because one day your renewable energy may stall. One day something might happen, and then you need backup. You can either look at it that way, meaning your renewable is the mainstream, diesel is the backup, or from the other perspective. In terms of COVID, well, it's linked to, in the tourism sector, no tourists. Income is perhaps, well, it's low, as we can see, the experience so far. If you had your own renewable energy, you will simply don't have to keep on paying, I'd say, an electricity bill that may be, it'll be escalated when you have visitors, but if there are no visitors, you have a baseline consumption. Yeah, meaning even though you turn everything off, there's some consumption in electricity. So if you have renewables, your baseline is sort of catered for. But there's no, I'd say, perfect answer to that. But reliability depends on a system design, depends on what is it for. So if your renewables in a small place, you want to use solar hot water, that's it. It's an upfront investment, and that's it. As long as you can pay that back within its lifetime, you get the gain. Yeah? But reliability in terms of renewable energy, it's very difficult to attain depending on the design. Look at Samoa's energy mix. You have hydro, you have biomass, you have diesel, you have solar, and you have some wind. There's 5. So the mix is quite good, because if one stops operating, you can have the other 4 to support it. So reliability in that sense, it's not good to just put all your eggs in one basket. Look at the nuclear incident that happened in Japan a couple of years ago. Yeah, when the nuclear plant died, or the accident happened, the whole prefecture was sort of out of electricity, because they only relied on that. If you have a good mix, evenly distributed, that brings in reliability as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Payne. Do you have a question or comment, Greg?
It was a question I was going to relay from SBTO. It's not necessarily for Rupeni, but it's for anyone in the room. They were just asking in regards, because there was the question about grants and funding to set up renewables. Their question was, so what funding is potentially available for small operators? Because if there's no large grants for beach valets and small operators, are there any small grants that are more easily attainable, like any government rebates? Does anyone know? That's just their question from SBTO to Samoa. because they're wondering what's the incentive for a small operator to invest into renewables.
Craig, if I may,
Yes.
in terms of small grants, the only challenge is, for example, if you look at UNDP has small grants. It's up to about 50,000 USD, yeah, and it's targeted communities, or it's targeted to, mainly communities at the community level.
Mm-hmm.
The only challenge is those small grants have specific focus areas from time to time. Yeah, so I think right now most of the funding goes to, for example, on gender-based violence, all those elements on good governance. I know some communities around here have tapped into their waste disposal in terms of small grants. But small grants, that's up to 50,000 US dollars. Those are the ones available. In some countries, I mentioned development banks, but it's not a grant. It becomes a, how would you call those, soft loans? But
Interest-free loans.
Yeah, it enables the potential investor to start off something. But small grants, I think it's very difficult unless you have bilateral areas like, for example, the British from China or JICA, but most of the assistance are large ones.
Okay. Thank you, Rupeni.
The other element to do is you go collectively. Yeah. So, for example, the Samoa Tourism Association can have a collective proposal of perhaps 10 operators or so. That's one way to do it. So you increase the scale, the economies of scale, and then you tap for a larger grant. That's one way to do it.
So a cooperative, get a number of resort owners to work together, or a particular village area that will have a number of resorts in that area, or beach whales, and they could all apply together.
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions from the floor? If not, we have SPTO waiting to present their slides.
No questions? Okay, go ahead, Ansel.
Thank you, Greg. I believe that some here, the targets that the renewable energy is aiming to achieve, I think, by 2030. They're looking at achieving 100% energy by, I'm not so sure if it's 2030 or by 2050. So given that we have this I would say ambitious targets to achieve. So wondering to know the role of STA in promoting this renewable energy initiative in the country to assist us to ensure achieving these targets that are already in place.
Did you catch that, Greg?
I did hear that, but I'm not STA, so I don't know the answer to that.
Any of our colleagues from STA please contribute to that discussion?
I hear they have a plan, a strategy?
Yeah.
So
I can answer. I can answer on behalf of STA because I was one of the consultants. Oh, there's Rob.
Yes.
Rob can also answer the question.
Disappeared. Very good. It's just Robert. You've just arrived in time to field a question directed to STA.
Sorry, what was the question, Greg?
Well, it's probably best to come from the floor where it came. They're asking about. Well, anyway, I'll let them do it. It's about STA's support for renewables.
Yes. Don't mind if you believe that's Rob again?
We have set renewable energy targets to be achieved by 2030. So we'd like to know what is the role of STA in assisting us in trying to achieve this target by the given time frame.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I'm aware of the the targets that have been set. Working closely with the R&D team, and the report was prepared by Castalia. Yes, so specifically for tourism, I know the focus was on looking at reducing the gas emissions through energy saving appliances to be incorporated into hotel operations. And just recently also there was a project which again worked closely on with the renewable energy team at MNRE, and this focused on an energy audit which was conducted using one of the hotels, Messina to be specific, and a lot of learnings came out of that around how can hotels be more energy efficient, and really try and not only bring down their costs, in particular on energy use, but then also contributing also to the the targets which are in place, and then also sustainable tourism.
Thank you, Rob. Did you hear that, Greg?
Yes, I got that. We're still recording, so yeah, that's good. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Rob. Are there any other questions or statements from the floor? I can see someone's hand waving just off to the left of Rebeni. Is there a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask Mr. Rebeni, thank you for the informative presentation on renewable energy. I just wanted to ask and add on to one of RE's representatives' comments. From your perspective, working in the region in the Pacific, will we ever achieve that 1% target by 2030? From your perspective as a renewable energy.
The good thing I'm not a politician. Anyway, to me, it depends on how you report it. Yeah, you throw a blanket target of 100% renewables. When it comes to reporting, then you try to justify where you met that 100%. Yeah, so when it that's how you can look at it. So, for example, if you go 100% renewables, then you ask again, and they say it's only electricity. So that means your cars are still running on diesel and unleaded. Then you go to electricity, and then you ask them, and then they say it's a base load, which is 100%, meaning it's only the load that when someone goes to sleep, you need to generate that much electricity. Yeah. So when it comes to reporting, it's very important. So when you say it's only the base load, if the Afulilo Dam is filled up, it can be only hydro running throughout. Yeah. So when you do your reporting, you can say from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Samoa was on 100% renewable energy in the electricity sector. Yeah. So it comes down to reporting. But if you look at it generally from a national perspective, it's very difficult to reach that 100%. It's how you quantify it and how do you narrow it down, how do you report it. Yeah? Then you can when you come to those sort of details, then it not only shows that you are on track to meet your target, but then it shows that there is a lot of things that the country has done. So you can see our discussions today alludes to a lot of things. You need policy, you need financial mechanisms, you need, don't forget capacity. You need engineers, you need those people who can operate them and so forth. Yeah. So to me, 100% target, the details plays a very important role on how do you quantify that and how do you report it.